Hi Founder fans, Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day Week in Review, where we will talk about the last 7 founders I published about in the last, 7 days. I do know. I was just saying that. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your patience. We're a few minutes late today. I ran into a few technical difficulties. I, as you may know, upgraded my setup over the last few days and didn't think that, long story short, when I put in this new screen here with our founders, I got to change through these as we go, and I didn't consider that I had to resize all of the images. I thought I could pop them in. So, justification, an explanation, or I guess I should say excuses for my tardiness out of the way. Let's talk about the American Revolution, shall we? So, first of all, we are going to start with Robert Kirkwood. Now, Robert Kirkwood, one of my longtime readers and viewers who was nice enough to send me a book that is no longer in my direct vicinity, Adam Lewis, actually requested that I talk about Robert Kirkwood. So I did look into him. Now, Kirkwood is mostly known for a long train of important events throughout the war. He participated in most of the important battles in the northern department of the Revolution before moving south. Notably during his service, and most of what I read about him was serving in the war. Because he was from Delaware, he had trouble getting to a certain rank because, as you know, they would generally take generals of major generals, brigadier generals would generally come from. They try and evenly disperse them throughout the states, but also the more powerful states with bigger population generally had those positions taken up for them. So Kirkwood only ever ascends to become I believe a captain during the actual war. Yeah, captain during the war. Now, he does eventually rout out a spy. As the story goes, he was going through New Jersey during the Forage War and found a gentleman who mistook them for the British and was eager to tell them about the great spying he was doing for the British. At which point Kirkwood said, well, we're patriots and you're under arrest. From there, like I said, most of the time he's spending going through the actual revolution, fighting all over the place in many important battles. He's part of an outstanding group of a Delaware regiment that really excels throughout the war. He impresses many important people. And then after the war ends, again, he never really gets the accolades he seemingly deserves, because he, only hit a certain level of fame during the war. There's only so many, soldiers that can be extremely famous, and Kirkwood does slip under the cracks. But Robert Kirkwood ends up moving to what we now know as Wheeling, West Virginia, at the time Wheeling, Virginia, where he becomes a leader on the frontier. And then when the the Northwest Indian War, as that starts heating up, though it was always kind of there in the background, Kirkwood turns his house into a fort, for lack of a better term. And on more than one occasion, the Native Americans attack the town, and the community jumps into Kirkwood's house to use as a fort to defend themselves, which they successfully do. But as the Northwest Indian War really accelerates, they need help. And of course, Robert Kirkwood is eager to join. He's a soldier through and through. He does join the war, but he's actually sent to back east for a little bit to talk to, after the Washington administration comes into play, he goes back to talk to Secretary of War Henry Knox. And not only does he deliver a letter from the leaders on the frontier to Henry Knox saying, hey, we need some help, Henry, he also ends up he communicates to Henry Knox the need directly. And I actually read a letter from Knox that was from Knox to, I believe it was Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State at the time, saying, I spoke to Robert Kirkwood. He makes a very convincing argument. We need to send supplies out west. And they do. Kirkwood successfully secures these supplies, and they are sent out west. And then he goes to serve under the leader out west, who is Arthur St. Clair. And unfortunately for Arthur St. Clair, though he is a revolutionary through and through, he's appointed with running the Northwest Indian War, and he does not do a great job. And there is a catastrophic battle that has become known as St. Clair's defeat. Now, this defeat is what eventually gets the name is eluding me. Anthony Wayne, because of the St. Clair's defeat, is sent over to take over the war on St. Clair's behalf, and puts together the first United States Army under the name the Legion of the United States. And ever since, we've essentially, there was one little break in there just before Adams came in, but essentially ever since, his name keeps disappearing on me, ever since Anthony Wayne, Mad Anthony, took over for St. Clair, the United States Army has really been in existence. Now, sadly, Robert Kirkwood was fighting under St. Clair at the time, and he is killed at St. Clair's defeat. In fact, he is shot in the stomach, and he crawls to a tree or to the side, and one of his proteges actually sees him and goes over to Kirkwood, and according to this young gentleman who was there, Kirkwood asked to be executed. He asked his protege to kill him because he didn't want to be left to the Native Americans. Now, this gentleman did not have the heart to do that to his friend and mentor, and instead retreats with the rest of the army, leaving leaving Kirkwood with hundreds of other Americans who would be finished off by the Native Americans when they arrived, one way or another. By the time Anthony Wayne gets there and they retake the land, everyone there is already dead, including Kirkwood, whose burial we are not sure about where it is, though he does in Ohio have some gravestones marking his the area. So he does have a monument to him. So he did get at least that recognition, as well as recognition from you and I here at Founder of the Day. So that is Robert Kirkwood. Let's bounce over here to Simon Snyder. Okay. Simon Snyder. Simon Snyder was a young man who was actually apprenticed to an artisan as a young man. He did not come from the wealth you might expect for someone who would go on to become governor of Pennsylvania. He ends up skipping the American Revolutionary War itself and instead opens and operates a grist mill because he has to take care of his family. This is not uncommon at the time. You know, we like to think every single person either signed up for the Brits or the Patriots, but no, most people stayed out of the war. Simon Snyder was one of these people. He opened up a grist mill, but he became a leader in his community, and he actually is elected as a justice of the peace at a very young age because his community trusts him. Furthermore, he dedicates himself to public virtue, and by the time he's in his early 30s, he's actually sent to the Pennsylvania 1790 Constitutional Convention. Pennsylvania's first constitution, as we've talked about, it was very strange. It had one legislature. It didn't have a governor. Technically, it had a president who was really president of that legislature. It's very interesting, and it didn't work out super great. So, instead, they made a governorship, and Simon Snyder was part of the group that made that constitution. But then he goes back home, where he remains a justice of the peace, but he keeps operating his grist mill until 1797. 7 years later, Snyder was elected by his constituents to the Pennsylvania State House of Representatives. Now, he's there, and he does a very good job. In fact, on 3 separate occasions in the early 1780s, he ends up becoming Speaker of the House, essentially one of the main players in Pennsylvania's House. Again, this is at a time that, although the federal government had been established, the state governments were very largely important, much, much more important to the people's lives than the federal government was at the time. So Snyder is a Democratic Republican, which is great because Pennsylvania was largely Democratic Republican by this point, as was most of the country, and Thomas Jefferson was president. He gets along swimmingly with Mr. Jefferson and gets along swimmingly with President James Madison. And it's about this time that Snyder is actually elected governor of Pennsylvania. This gristmill operator is just such a charismatic, knowledgeable politician that he goes from gristmill owner to governor of Pennsylvania, the 3rd governor, in fact. Now, he did run once to outseat Thomas McKeon, who was the previous governor and a Declaration of Independence signer, pretty important guy. And then he does not win the first time. But the second time he runs, McKeon resigns because you could only run for 3 consecutive terms at the time in Pennsylvania. And Snyder doesn't beat McKeon. McKeon finishes his 3rd term, and Snyder comes in and takes over and becomes the 3rd governor of Pennsylvania, as I said. And he holds the position for 3 terms, so 9 years. During this time, the War of 1812 breaks out, and Pennsylvania is very important to supporting the War of 1812. Again, it was one of the most Democratic Republican states. They actively supported Ben Franklin. They also, because, you have Henry Clay being a war hawk at the time in Kentucky, Western Pennsylvania is not far from Kentucky, and a lot of the same sentiments prevailed out there. So McKeon is very important. Simon Snyder is very important to James Madison's overseeing of the War of 1812. He recruits a lot of men. He gets fiscal support. There's not a lot of fighting in Pennsylvania, though it is close to the Erie. Erie, Pennsylvania does touch Lake Erie. And a lot of the fighting of the War of 1812, the naval battles, were on the Great Lakes, which are better described as seas. If they weren't, my understanding is if they weren't freshwater, they would be considered seas because they are gigantic. Anyway, after Snyder finishes his third term, he's actually floated as a candidate for vice president when James Monroe runs. Now, Snyder declines the position and declines to run in general, but he was floated, and he would have been expected to win. I mean, James Madison essentially ran unopposed. The second time he ran unopposed. The first time the Democratic Republicans had such a sweeping majority in the nation, especially with the fervor of winning the War of 1812, aka the Second American Revolutionary War. In addition to, James Monroe's first term is considered the era of good feelings. So it would have been really nice for Snyder to have been vice president for that time, but he doesn't. He decides not to run, and instead we get Daniel D. Tompkins, who was governor of New York through the War of 1812, which was a much more important state during that war. But we're not going to get into that now. That is a brief history of the life of Simon Snyder, 3rd governor of Pennsylvania. Let's see. Hi, Misfit. Thanks for coming in. Who is our next founder? Okay. Elizabeth House Trist. Elizabeth House Trist came from a not very wealthy family. I'd call them a middling family because her husband was actually an officer in the British Army. So they had enough money, but not an extraordinary amount. Now, her mother actually ran a boarding house in Philadelphia. And she remained in Philadelphia when the Patriots were there, and then when the British came through, again, her husband was a British officer, no one seemed to care, and then the British kind of left, and the Patriots came back, and she was still there. And her mother kept running the boarding house. And in this boarding house, some very famous people came through. Most notably was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson stays in 1782 to 84, and up until his wife dies, essentially. And while he's there in the house of Elizabeth House Trist, they become fast friends, and they would end up becoming lifelong friends. And their correspondence, I read through a good amount of it, is really, really interesting. But eventually, Elizabeth House Trist finds out that her husband is stationed in New Orleans, down in Natchez, which isn't quite New Orleans, but down the Mississippi. And Elizabeth House Trist decides, I'm going to go stay with my husband. The war's over. Let's go. And she travels across Pennsylvania in a carriage, gets to the Mississippi, and takes the Mississippi down to Natchez. And what's really interesting is she's the first woman that we know about who actually wrote a journal about her trip. So she's the first woman to document a trip across Pennsylvania and down the Mississippi River. It's a fascinating set of documents. Now, sadly, she gets down to Natchez to find out her husband had died. And she continues on in New Orleans for a little while, but decides to come back to Philadelphia where she actually knows people. And she takes a boat by way of Havana back up to Philadelphia. And she remains in Philadelphia for about 20 years. And during this time, her good friend Thomas Jefferson, she's been corresponding with the whole time, he makes his way up and eventually becomes president of the United States. Now, one of her sons actually studied under Jefferson for a little while, studied the law. And then Jefferson, when he becomes president, well, he needs to appoint someone as customs collector to the port of New Orleans. And he appoints one of Elizabeth House Trist's sons. And Elizabeth decides to sail with her son to New Orleans. And they do. They go to New Orleans in 1803, 20 years after she had already been there. And when she gets back to New Orleans, very quickly, her son dies too. So for the second time in her life, she traveled all the way to New Orleans just to watch one of the men in her family pass away. Now, this time she stays for about 4 years, trying to make a life for herself, but again, just doesn't seem to love it there, and again travels back to Philadelphia, though quickly she is convinced by her friend Thomas Jefferson, hey, maybe don't live in Philadelphia, why don't you come live in Virginia for a while? And she does. Now, Elizabeth House Trist kind of becomes a super wealthy vagrant at this point because she never owns a house again. She just travels between estates of her friends in Virginia, staying with friends here and there. Now, again, she's living with very wealthy people, living a very high life, but doesn't take up a job. She doesn't seem to have any income. She just kind of bounces around. Now, I will say, eventually, she moves to... she actually moves to Monticello and lives with some of Thomas Jefferson's family, if not Jefferson himself, for a while. While she's there, Trist and Jefferson have their grandchildren get married. She actually sees her grandson, Nicolas Triss, marry one of Thomas Jefferson's granddaughters, whose name is, of course, escaping me right now. Right, yeah, Matt. Elizabeth's son was Jefferson's son-in-law. His grandson-in-law. If I'm not, I believe. Yeah. So they get married because, again, the son that you would be referencing, Matt, he dies in New Orleans. But it's his son, Nicolas Triss, that marries one of Jefferson's granddaughters. And they are kind of, in a weird way, family now. Now, I will say, Elizabeth, after they get married, again, by this point, by the time their grandkids are getting married, Elizabeth's in her 70s, Jefferson's in his 80s. They both pass away not long after that, but Elizabeth actually dies at Monticello. We know this because of 2 letters that were written, but we don't know where she was actually buried. I believe she was buried, historians believe that she was buried at the family graveyard, the Jefferson family graveyard, but there's no tombstone for her, which is very peculiar. There probably should have been, but the assumption is she's there somewhere. Now, as for Nicolas Triss, as Matt is mentioning down here, yes, I believe they did have the same name. I looked a little bit into it. Her son that Jefferson appointed to the collector of the Post of New Orleans, he does pass away pretty quickly, but his son, Nicolas Triss, ends up marrying into the Jefferson family, as I said. Now, Nicolas Triss, I read into a little bit. Now, I don't know a ton about him, but he would go on to play, he would go into pretty high-level player. He would not have really many positions in the federal government, though he would represent the United States in creating the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, I believe it's pronounced, which would end the Mexican-American War. Now, he was actually called back from his post there, negotiating that treaty, but as always at the time, word arrived very slowly, and people did not find out. So he ends up negotiating for James K. Polk the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ends the Mexican-American War and essentially gives the United States Arizona, New Mexico, and Southern California. And his grandfather-in-law was Thomas Jefferson. So that is Elizabeth House Trist with a little bit of her kids in there too. So let's move on. I'm going to take a quick sip of my beverage because of how thirsty I am. And we're talking about Mason Weems. Let me see. Okay. Mason Weems. Mason Weems is the person who gave us the cherry tree story. Real quick, you know what? I'm going to answer Matt's question real quick before we move on. No, that's not her picture. She has no known image. That is a random silhouette of a female from the 18th century. Good question, Matt. Unfortunately, many of the women we talk about do not have silhouettes. In fact, if you notice, you may have noticed when I was talking to Professor Allison this week about Deborah Sampson. I actually used the same generic women's silhouette image for Deborah Sampson because she also doesn't have an image that we know about. So, all right, good question. Thank you for calling me out. Mason Locke Weems. Mason Locke Weems is famous for being the person who gave us the George Washington chopping down the cherry tree story. Now, we are going to get to that, but before we get to that part of his life, we got to talk about the beginning of his life. Mason Weems doesn't fight in the Revolutionary War, but around the end of the war, he actually goes to Europe to study and be ordained as a preacher because he wants to profess he wants to sermonize congregations on behalf of the Lord. Now he goes to Europe and runs into a little bit of trouble. You see, many people were Anglican, which meant they were part of the Church of England. And unfortunately, when the Americans threw off England, they kind of threw the church with it. Not necessarily on purpose, but the Church of England demanded that you take a loyalty oath to the King of England if you wanted to be ordained. And, well, most of these people who were throwing off the King of England didn't want to take a loyalty oath to the King of England, as you might imagine. And this becomes a little bit tricky. Now, I am not very thoroughly versed on scholarship regarding religion at the time. But my understanding is one of the major reasons the Episcopalian denomination was created, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I have asked a few people about this, one of the major reasons the Episcopalian religion was created was because the Americans didn't want to take an oath to the King of England, but they did believe essentially everything else. So Mason Weems is one of the people who finds himself in this position. He goes over to Europe and he's trying to get ordained as an Anglican minister. But unfortunately, no one wants to do that if he can't be, if he doesn't take an oath of loyalty to the king. So he contacts many people who are already in Europe, including John Adams, who's pretty helpful, Benjamin Franklin, who doesn't help out very much, and Samuel Chase, the signer of the Declaration of Independence, who just essentially happened to be there on business. And they come up with the idea, hey, maybe Mason Weems and a few other people could go to the Netherlands and be ordained there, or maybe Sweden. Maybe we can get ordained in Sweden. And all these ideas are floated, but still, since essentially, again, this is a gross generalization, but essentially one of the major reasons the Church of England was created was because King Henry VIII, several decades earlier, wanted to get a divorce, famously. And because of this, the Church of England wasn't really practiced in anywhere other than Great Britain. So it was very hard. No one could really officially ordain him. They were primarily Catholic, although, to be fair, denominations had spread out. For example, you look at the Puritans essentially before the American Revolution. They didn't just go straight from England to the United States. They went to Netherlands first, I believe, and the Mennonites went to Sweden first and then Germany before coming to the United States. So certain denominations of religions that were not just Catholicism had made their way to the continent by this point, but it wasn't precisely the same religion. Now, after about a year of negotiation and trying to find a way around this, the Treaty of Paris is signed, and as ratification approaches, they're essentially like, well, we do want everyone to be able to practice their religion. Like, even Great Britain, even the king was like, we do want everyone to be able to pray to God. Like, we don't want to deny people access to God. That's not going to get us into heaven. So eventually the Bishop of Canterbury, he does a quasi-legal ordination of Mason Weems and several other people, at which point Weems returns to the United States and helps to organize not just the Episcopal religion, but or denomination, I should say, but reorganize religion in the United States. Because there was, in the 1780s, after the American Revolution, there was an upheaval in religion, and essentially a reorganization of how all religion operated. Not how it views, not necessarily the practice of religion, not people's beliefs, although, they were changing at the time. We were about to hit the Second Great Awakening, by the way. But literally the practice of it. Over the next few decades, this is still a time where, even though the First Amendment to the Constitution says freedom of religion, that's in the United States, but certain states still had state religions, and you still had to pay, part of your taxes were tithes to one particular church. It's go on for a while in many places. Notably, Connecticut had a state religion until like 1816, 1817, when what's his name? Something Parsons started the Toleration Party. And that the Toleration Party simply wanted, I believe Connecticut was Congregationalist, and your taxes went to the Congregationalists, And there were Episcopalians who were like, well, no, I don't want my tax money to go to a church I don't believe it. And that's 30 years after the Constitution was ratified and the Bill of Rights was ratified. So it lasted a while. Anyway, Mason Weems comes back to the United States, and he says, okay, well, I'm going to be a preacher now, and he starts being called Parson Weems. It becomes more his regular, better-known moniker. Parson Weems essentially becomes a traveling, itinerant preacher. He does have a family. He has a lot of kids with his wife, but he travels a lot, goes out into the countryside, talking to people, preaching, and eventually to support his income, he starts selling books also. So he becomes a traveling preacher / book salesman, going out into the country where books weren't necessarily so readily available, and he would sell his wares and preach his preachings, and he became pretty well known for it. Eventually, he decides to publish a book. See, George Washington passes away in 1799. And just the following year, there was kind of a rush to idolize Washington. And the following year, Weems publishes his first book, a biography about Washington entitled A History of the Life and Death, Virtues and Exploits of General George Washington. And this is at a time where, while there were historians coming around and people were starting to take historical accuracy very seriously, wasn't necessary to sell books yet. And you could make things up if you wanted to. And in his first book, he only doesn't make up that much, but he lionizes Washington. The point of this first edition was to, be like, the great general hero of America is dead, and this is the life he led. It's amazing, isn't it? Now, he publishes a new edition every year, and in 1805, he publishes a 5th edition. And the 5th edition is the first time we see a story that he heard from a woman who heard from someone else, who heard one time that maybe George Washington chopped down a cherry tree. And when confronted by his father about chopping down this cherry tree, he said, I cannot tell a lie. And I forget the exact quote, but I cut down the cherry tree. Whoopsie daisy. Give me my punishment, essentially. We all know the cherry tree story. And at this point, it's pretty well known that the cherry tree story was probably a fabrication. Mason Weems heard it from a story, heard it from a story, heard it from a story, and put it in the book, and then it became wildly famous. And I mean, Mason Weems' version, when I was doing my research, I read something like, probably most of what Abraham Lincoln learned as a kid about George Washington came from the Weems book. And most of what most of America learned from George Washington, because it became a bestseller. So most of what America learned about George Washington in the 1810s, 20s, 30s, 40s, Weems was the most popular biographer of Washington. So this cherry tree story that we all know and love, while we know now today, probably didn't happen. He's the reason we all think it happened. I should say, I heard, I voted for George and they accepted. So, how do I say this? I believe it was Henry Adams said something once that there's no way to definitely... It's absolutely possible that George Washington chopped down a cherry tree and told his father he could not tell a lie. Absolutely could have happened. There was very little chance that happened. Because why wouldn't he lie about cutting down the tree? He was a reasonable person. I do want to note also, this is not the only biography that Weems wrote. Weems actually ended up writing several books, including one about Benjamin Franklin, because he tried to ride the high of George Washington, his George Washington book. But he also wrote a biography of Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, and this book also got a lot of publication. And it's interesting, as I was saying before about Robert Kirkwood, like most of the generals, while we do remember a lot of the soldiers of the American Revolution as best we can, not all of them are all that famous. Not all of them have like TV shows with John Wayne in them, right? Or no, it wasn't even John Wayne. Was it Leslie Nielsen? Not all of them get TV shows and movies throughout the 19th century. The Swamp Fox, Francis Marion, does. And a lot of the reason for his fame is because Mason Weems was riding the popularity of his Washington book, when he put out the Swamp Fox book. And it certainly helped make this a bigger, more popular character. So while he may have made up a long-standing fib about George Washington, we do definitely want to give him credit for giving him, really giving Francis Marion the popularity he still carries and still deserves to this day. So thanks, Mason Weems. Good job on that one. Let's see. Yeah, George was super young when his dad died, but that's the thing about the cherry tree story is he was like supposed to be like 8 or 9. You know, like cherry trees aren't that thick, so. I'm gonna take a sip of this. How are we doing on time? Let's see, 31. Oh, okay. Oh man, we're actually going pretty fast. Okay, who's next? Brutus. Brutus. All right, Founder fans. Brutus X. Brutus number 10. In Brutus number 10, he is following up his discussion about standing armies with more talk about standing armies. No taxes anymore after, he did 8 of them on taxes, and he's happy to move on to standing armies for 2 in a row. Now, this one's interesting because in the last article, Brutus number 9, he talks about standing armies and its abuse, the potential for the government to abuse a standing army. But in this one, he says that's not the only thing we have to fear. In fact, standing armies can also be troublesome on their own, independent of the government. And he starts off with a brief history of standing armies. He points out 2 very famous examples, Caesar and Oliver Cromwell. And he notes that ancient Rome and Great Britain in the 1600s were very proud of the liberties their people had. They were 2 of the freest nations in the history of the world. And in one, Caesar is fighting with the army to protect freedom, and the other, Oliver Cromwell, is essentially fighting off a king to secure freedom. But in both, the head of the army then uses the army to get rid of independence and take over and essentially create dictatorships. Caesar storms back and conquers Rome. I know he's very often viewed as a happy role model to people on the peripheral, but Caesar gets stabbed for a reason, like by a group of senators. Again, I'm not going to get into that argument. That's thousands of years before when we're discussing today. But Caesar did take his army and conquer a free nation. At the same note, on the flip side, Oliver Cromwell had an army. They did fight for freedom. But then once freedom was achieved, Oliver Cromwell used that army to become a dictator. So Brutus then goes on to discuss the Newburgh conspiracy, and he actually talks about George Washington and gives George Washington a lot of credit. He's like, very easily George Washington could have taken his victorious army and marched it on Philadelphia and taken over as a Caesar or a Napoleon before there was a Napoleon. He could have just been dictator. In fact, he brings up that he doesn't name the Newburgh conspiracy particularly, but he does bring up there were many high-ranking generals and officers in the Continental Army who were like, what the hell are they doing in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress? Why don't we go and take over? Why don't we go make this right? Now, of course, George Washington famously gave his, take off my glasses, I can't see anymore speech and put a stop to all that nonsense because George Washington is an extraordinary character in revolutionary history. Not only did he not take his army and go seek power, but he actually told his generals to stop seeking power on his behalf and went home and resigned his commission. So it's one of the things that makes George Washington an exceptional character historically. And while I don't like to put, you talk about great men history and put anyone else above, put the credit entirely on the shoulders of one person, George Washington gets a lot of credit for saying, no thanks, I don't want to be dictator. It takes a very strong-willed person, a very strong-willed person to be able to say something like that. And Brutus rightfully gives Washington credit on that behalf and says how fortunate we are that our army that fought for freedom obtained its freedom as opposed to Cromwell, just like little over 100 years beforehand. Cromwell did what George Washington did, but instead of resigning his army, he kept going at it. And he took over, and things didn't end super great. After this, Brutus turns his attention to Federalist Paper number 25. As I said, the Federalists and and Brutus were kind of having a Lennon-McCartney battle up in the upper echelons of the newspapers in New York. And Hamilton wrote Federalist 24, and Brutus comes out with Brutus number 9 and directly responds to it. And then Hamilton writes Federalist number 25, and Brutus comes out with Brutus 10, responding directly to it. So, what Hamilton asserts in Federalist 25 is that, look, there's Shays' Rebellion, and I don't mention it in my article, but there was also an uprising in Pennsylvania that Hamilton also mentions. The Shays' Rebellion, the uprising in Pennsylvania, these insurrections are happening within states. So we need the federal government to bring up a more powerful army to suppress these kinds of maneuvers by the people. And Brutus responds with, no, we don't. We just did that. Brutus is saying, look, he doesn't name Hamilton. Hamilton's publishing under a pseudonym. He's not sure who's publishing, but essentially says, look, the Federalist Papers are saying that there was an uprising in Massachusetts that the state had to put down, and we need a standing army to put down these uprisings. But he acknowledged himself that the state of Massachusetts put down the uprising and didn't need a standing army. In fact, the state of Massachusetts, in time of crisis, raised an army, suppressed the insurrection, and then diluted the army again. Why do we need a standing army when we can take care of problems like this? And why do we need the federal government to put together a bigger standing army when we've already taken care of it at the state level, as Pennsylvania did, as several other situations arose? You know, a similar thing happens about this time, the paper money riots in New Hampshire. So there are uprisings. People are not happy to come back from the Revolutionary War and be a veteran and see what their governments are doing. So, either way, these were taken care of. The problems were taken care of. So why do we need this federal army to come in and do it for us? And then Brutus makes it clear he's not against the federal government being able to raise an army. He is for, as mentioned last week, the federal government should be able, or a confederated government should be able to secure enough soldiers to station the forts and ports to protect the people at their borders. And he's okay with raising an army like they raised the Continental Army all on their own in time of crisis. There just needs to be limits to when the army can be raised and how long it can be kept. And you don't just want it hanging around idle. Because you know the old sayings about idle hands, right? If there's nothing to do, the army's going to find something to do. And we don't want an army finding something to do. So that, in a nutshell, is Brutus number 10. Again, there are, I believe, 6 more that will be coming out over the next 6 weeks. Let's move along. We got 2 more. Now, of course, as I always say, over the weekend, I republished some old articles from my extensive collection, so I think you will enjoy these. Okay. Who are we talking about? Prince Henry. Okay. Lost it for a second. Prince Henry, King of the United States? Let's talk about it. So, in 1786, the United States was having a lot of troubles under the Articles of Confederation. That was acknowledged by pretty much everyone. It would continue to be acknowledged, you know, a year later when the Constitution was written, the following year to the ratification debates, even the people against the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists acknowledged there were some serious problems going on with the Articles of Confederation. There was not much getting done. Now, there were some issues that they didn't know how to resolve them. I want to remind you, at this point in time, most European nations, and therefore most of the commonly understood governments in the Western world, had kings. Most of them were constitutional monarchies of some nature, but there were kings and monarchs, and this is what the Americans were accustomed to. They had always had a king until a few years earlier. They only threw him off because he was being a real jerk about it. But the idea of having a king wasn't that far-fetched. And in fact, it had to be specifically written into the Constitution that there was no nobility. Additionally, many people were not super happy about the Society of the Cincinnatus that arose with officers of the Continental Army in the years after the American Revolutionary War ended, because many people looked at that as nobility. Some people weren't happy about it. Some people were members. George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, they were members of what other people considered a royal society. So the idea of royalty wasn't unheard of like it is today. It was an option. And that's why it's not super surprising that in 1786, President of the Continental Congress, Nathaniel Gorham, wrote a letter through some mediaries to Prince Henry of Prussia. And this letter basically said, hey Henry, how would you feel about coming to North America and becoming king of the United States? I'm obviously paraphrasing. It was written in French, I believe. And it went through Baron von Steuben, through his friends in France, to his friends in Prussia. Von Steuben was from Prussia. And they felt him out. Now, this never comes to fruition. I'm going to skip ahead right now and say, not only does it not come to fruition, it looks like Prince Henry wrote a letter saying no thank you for various reasons, which we'll get to, but he never actually sent out the letter. Now, that doesn't mean that it wasn't sent. In fact, no one was sure this happened for about 100 years when the letter that Henry never sent was found, which actually validated this whole story in the early 1900s. Very surprising to find that letter. So, Nathaniel Gorham, he ends up writing the Constitution. He ends up being a very important member of the Constitutional Convention. He is a founding father. Don't get mad at him for this story, because I know how easy it is for us to look back and be like, he wanted someone to take over as king. That's not what was happening. The Continental Congress was desperate for a solution, and this was a solution. Now let's talk about why they contacted Prince Henry. Prince Henry's older brother was Frederick the Great. Yes, we want to keep that in mind, that Frederick the Great was running Prussia at the time that the American Constitution was written. In fact, Catherine the Great was running Russia at exactly this time also, just to put some context there. Frederick the Great is considered Frederick the Great because he started, for many reasons, but he's one of the early... He's not the one who brought Germany together and unified Germany, but he set the wheels in motion to eventually unify Germany. And many later leaders of Germany would look back at Frederick the Great as the Great, who set the ball in motion. He was also an astounding military leader, and although he certainly did some things that are not cool to his people, he did many things that were seen, especially at the time, as he was one of the liberal monarchs, as they were called. He was leading the way in creating certain freedoms. Again, it was moves he made that would later create the Germany that we know and love today. I know Germany went through some hard times there in the 20th century, but he went through the unification process. Many of the freedoms Germans enjoy today can be traced back to Frederick the Great. And the American revolutionaries saw this, and they respected the changes he was making. They saw him as a liberal monarch who believed in many of the ideas of freedom and democracy that they believed in. But again, he was a king, and being a king wasn't that crazy an idea. Additionally, Frederick the Great, when the Germans were sending Hessians from Hessian, the mercenaries, the Hessian and various other mercenaries from Germany were going to Great Britain to sail to America and fight against the Patriots, Frederick the Great did not allow those Germans to travel through Prussia to go fight the revolutionaries. And it was another thing that the Americans really, really respected about Frederick the Great. What does this have to do with Prince Henry? Well, Prince Henry was Frederick the Great's younger brother. So, if Frederick the Great's doing a pretty good job, why, Prince Henry seems to be doing what's to think he wouldn't do such a good job? So they write him this letter, and they're like, hey, come be king, huh? And he ends up writing a letter that never comes back. And we're a little bit lucky he does, because it's within about 6 months that the Constitutional Convention is called together. A few months later, in 1787, the Constitutional Convention meets, which Nathaniel Gorham was a part of, and he was chairman of the Committee of the Whole, which means, as I've said before, he essentially, Washington would step down for most of the day, and Nathaniel Gorham ran most of the show and was chairman of the Constitutional Convention for arguably about the same amount of time as George Washington. So again, don't be freaked out at Nathaniel Gorham. He signs the document. He's a very, 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 very important creator of the United States of America. He sends the letter, and since no response comes back and they call the Constitutional Convention, it kind of fades out, and we forget about it until about 1820, when Rufus King is running for president as the presidential candidate for the dying, if not already dead, Federalist Party. And he is sad for Rufus King. He gets a lot of grief for seemingly no reason. But Rufus King was running for president, and he was slandered because there was no way he was going to beat James Monroe. And they were just slandering him in public. And they were saying a lot of things that absolutely weren't true. And among these things that absolutely weren't true, they said something that was very, very true. And it was, hey, Rufus King participated with Nathaniel Gorham. He tried to make the king, Prince Henry of Prussia, king of the United States. And Rufus King was kind of like, no, no, that didn't happen. Because, people would lie all the time in the papers back then. Although I shouldn't say that. Rufus King didn't say much about it. It's hard to find an outright denial. He just kind of, ignores the question. And again, they couldn't prove it. And it wouldn't be until about 80 years after that someone even finds the letter and validates this story is even true. So he could pretty easily say, no, not a big deal, don't worry about it. But the story, again, it was so low-key at the time, despite the fact the president of the Continental Congress sending this letter to offer him to be a king, it was kept so quiet, people didn't really find out about it until 30-plus years later, almost 35 years later, when the public first found out about it, and it was another 80 years after that it was actually vindicated as a real story. So, hope you enjoy that. I find it to be one of the most fascinating stories of the American Revolution. I presume you do too. Let's go. Last person. Okay. This is a name I probably can't pronounce right. I believe it is Eleuthère Irénée Dupont de Nemours. I'm going to call him DuPont because we know him as DuPont. Because yes, DuPont is a chemical company that is wildly successful, and even if you don't know a lot about the modern company, you surely have heard the name in your lifetime. And the person who created DuPont has an extremely interesting background. He was born in the France. While he was in the France, he grew up to a very wealthy father. He was sent by his father to study. His father was a renowned economist and assistant of King Louis XVI. So his father had friends in very high places. Because of this, the younger DuPont went and was given a great education. He learned a lot about chemistry and explosives and gunpowder. And in fact, his first job was he made gunpowder for the French army, King Louis XVI's French army, some of which probably made its way to the United States to help fight in the war. Now, additionally, his father was a publisher, and DuPont, in addition to his other studies, helped publish books for his father's print shop. And he published newspapers for his father's print shop. And as this time, the French Revolution was coming, and he read everything that was being published in his father's print shop, and he got certain Republican ideals. Now, this was not a great idea during the French Revolution, especially if you were nobility, because once the French Revolution breaks out, originally the DuPont and his father are welcomed by the revolutionaries. Okay, yeah, print us some stuff. But then people start getting guillotined left and right, and they were nobility, and they did not like seeing their noble friends getting guillotined. They were trying to hang out with the cause. They wanted to promote the Republican values, but you can't, not even kill us off. Eventually, they don't like the whole idea, and they actually help King Louis escape Paris, though that doesn't last long, and King Louis doesn't get things doing so good. DuPont and his father are both arrested during the Reign of Terror, and DuPont's father is scheduled to be executed, but fortunately, the Reign of Terror ends really when the Directory takes over and then Napoleon comes around, ending the Reign of Terror and actually, like it or not, his methods, he did cool down the public violence in France. After this, really disenchanted with France having, almost been executed, the DuPont family decides to relocate somewhere. Now, the younger DuPont had made friends with an American in Paris during this time, a young middle-aged man named Thomas Jefferson. And because they were so friendly with Jefferson, Jefferson convinces DuPont, Jefferson's good at convincing people to move to the United States. We were talking about Elizabeth Trist earlier. Now he convinces the DuPont family to move to New York City. Most of them moved to New York City, except today's hero, Elithier Irene Dupont de Nemours, E.I. DuPont, moves to Maryland, where he buys land from Constitution signer Jacob Broom, and starts, what else? A gunpowder manufacturer, because he had so much experience with gunpowder. And the American gunpowder, for lack of a better word, at least from his perspective, was garbage. It was garbage gunpowder, and DuPont wanted to make some seriously sweet gunpowder. That worked. End of sentence. That worked. And he did. And while he's there, he ends up making he creates the E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company. That's the name of his company. Over the years, it becomes simply known as DuPont. And this is in the early 1800s again. He comes over just about the time Thomas Jefferson's taking over as president. DuPont comes to the United States. Again, his family moves to New York, but he starts making gunpowder. Gunpowder helps, especially in the War of 1812, when the Americans win. It's nice to have real, actual working gunpowder. And furthermore, he expands the company. And the company's expanded now for over 200 years. And it makes everything in the chemistry field, from this item to that item. I don't know a lot about chemistry. I'm sure powders and potions. I'm sure they make weapons. And, fill in the blank. Go ahead and look up what DuPont makes. Again, it's a name you recognize. I didn't take a lot of time to look up into what they're making nowadays, but it's a wide variety of chemicals and chemical-related substances. And that is the foundation of DuPont. It is a Frenchman, and most of his story is in France, but he comes over and is a founder of good American gunpowder. So I hope you enjoyed the videos today. Let's see, where are we at here? Oh, just under an hour. Nailed it. Misfit coming in, DuPont de Nemours. No, I can't. I took several years of French and did not do very good in it in high school. Largely due to pronunciation. Also to not trying very hard. Just look up the meaning. The bridge to Nemours. DuPont means the bridge to Nemours. Oh, Matt. Oh, there was a name I was just reading. Oh. Okay. Oops, I didn't mean to hit my keyboard. Did I screw everything up? I was just, okay, this is the way off. I don't know how I got into this last night. I was like watching TV and just scrolling through my phone, clicking on random things. And this is not related to the American Revolution. It is related to Matt's discussion. I was reading about James Van Der Beek, 90s teen idol. And he was, the name Van Der Beek, I believe is bridge to the creek. So, 2 bridge references in less than 24 hours of my life based on random last names. I just wanted to bring that up because it ties into Matt's comment that DuPont means bridge to Nemours. So, great. I'm glad we worked that out. Anyway, that's today's video. If you guys have any questions, you can always contact me. Sorry for that little delay at the beginning there. I hope you enjoyed the video. I certainly enjoyed making it. Thank you guys, and I am going to get out of here. Okay, so wait, this is the weekly wrap-up. So I'm going to end by bringing myself big and give you guys a nice like and subscribe. See you tomorrow. James Madison's going to be here tomorrow. So come tomorrow, like and subscribe, and round bottom.